It is the nation's first fifth-generation fighter, as well as the only one of its kind in service and the only stealth aircraft in operation with VKS, which received its first production example in 2020. Russia is avoiding using its most modern fighter in Ukraine, according to British intelligence. The latest British intelligence report highlights that the Russian aerospace forces have been using the 57th generation Sukhoi Su-5 Felon fighter against Ukraine since June 2022. Russia, however, avoids deploying its most modern aircraft on Ukrainian territory. The Su-57 made its first flight almost 13 years ago, when it was still called the T-50 Pakfa. It is the country's first fifth-generation fighter, as well as the only one of its kind in service and the only stealth aircraft in operation with VKS, which received its first production example in 2020. Called Felon by NATO, the Su-57 is Russia's most modern and advanced fighter. The model was even combat tested in Syria in 2018, still in the prototype phase. While the presence of the aircraft in the Middle East was at the time highly publicized by Moscow, the use of the Su-57 in the conflict in Eastern Europe followed a completely opposite path. In May, about 3 months after the outbreak of war, Russian state media already reported the use of the aircraft against Ukraine. However, it was not until October that an official source acknowledged and welcomed the Su-57's participation in the Special Military Operation, SMO. On the other hand, the British Ministry of Defence claims that VKS has been carrying out Felon missions in Ukraine since June, using long-range air-to-air and air-to-surface missiles against targets in the country invaded 10 months ago. However, despite the clear superiority of the Su-57 over the models used by Ukraine, MiG-29, Su-24, Su-25 and Su-27, the MOD claims that the offensive flights of the Russian stealth fighter do not exceed the limits of Russian territory. Russia is very likely to prioritize avoiding reputational damage, reduced export prospects and compromised sensitive technology that would result from any loss of Felon to Ukraine. This is symptomatic of Russia's persistent risk-averse approach to employing its air force in war. In other words, Russia uses the Su-57 in operations against Ukraine, but only on its own territory, without crossing the border, to avoid possible losses, and possible capture, of its most important carrier. Advance. Logically, it is more difficult for Ukraine to shoot down a Su-57 than a Su-35, for example, but it is not impossible. The MOD also cites the sensitive technology compromise in the event that a Su-57 is shot down. In September, Ukrainian forces captured one of Russia's most advanced electronic warfare systems, found alongside the wreckage of a downed Su-30 fighter in March. This fact has raised questions about the possible negligence of Russia in clearing the plane's landing zone to prevent sensitive equipment from falling into the hands of the enemy. A possible downing of the Su-57 would only bring more tribulations to Moscow, which has already gone through a difficult period since the invasion of Ukraine. As well as being a problem in terms of security, it would be a huge embarrassment for the Russians, whose performance in the war has been heavily criticized and seen as ineffective. Moreover, Russia is still trying to sell the Su-57 to other countries, which would be at a great disadvantage if the stealth aircraft were shot down in Ukraine. Statements by Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu paving the way for Turkey to acquire fighter jets from a third country if the United States refuses to deliver its F-35s have turned the spotlight on the Russian model Su-57. For several weeks, American officials have been talking about the threat of canceling the sale and therefore the delivery to Turkey of the F-35 fighters if Ankara does not cancel the purchase of the Russian S-400 anti-aircraft defense system. In statements on the subject, the head of Turkish diplomacy mentioned the possibility of acquiring elsewhere the planes necessary for the defense of his country. This statement brought to the fore the Russian alternatives. Faced with the American F-35, yet manufactured by several countries including Turkey, Russia has a fifth-generation warplane, the Su-57. This aircraft has certain characteristics superior to that of the F-35 for certain criteria, while the reverse is true for other criteria. Developed around the concept of information synthesis, the F-35 is capable of developing a dynamic synthetic image of the data of an area and sharing it in real time with friendly entities. In addition, the F-35 is able to coordinate the movements of other aircraft in enemy airspace. The Su-57 was designed with another priority, ensuring superiority in the air against enemy air threats. To this end, the Su-57 did not make it a priority to be completely invisible like the F-35. Russian air doctrine prioritizes being able to see stealth aircraft over using stealth aircraft. Su-57 and F-35 strengths. The Su-57 is expected to join the Russian Air Force fleet this year, while the F-35 is already in use in some countries, including those in the program. The Russian plane, Su-57, has a certain number of important characteristics: the supersonic flight mode without heating, takeoff and landing over short distances, stealth technologies, low radar signature, weapons embedded in the closed parts or the mode super maneuverable. For its part, the F-35 can also take off and land at short distances, take off and land vertically. It is stealthy, ghost, invisible on radar, and also has weapons in its closed parts. The Su-57 can reach the maximum speed of 2,600 km per hour, while the F-35 can only do better than 1,931 km per hour. The fifth-generation Russian fighter is also more efficient in terms of flight time, up to 5.8 hours against 2.36 for the F-35. The Su-57 can carry up to 10,000 kilograms of combat load, while the F-35 is limited to 8,600 kilograms. Finally, the Russian plane has a fuel reserve capacity of 11,100 kilograms, while its American competitor is limited to 8,900 kilograms.
Все, приняли, хорошо.
Занимаем опору 100-800, чуть-чуть гасим скорость. Только плавно.
А перестраиваться когда?
Начали гасить. Нормально стоим? Ага.
При обгоне строго на своих высот.
Точно.
Бомбовый удар смешанного авиационного полка, авиабаза Бутурлиновка, военный летчик первого класса Алексей Лобода. В данном случае выполняется проход пары. Боевой ролонный ввод пикирования, условная атака наземной цели. Летчик-испытатель первого класса Андрей Шендей и летчик первого класса Игорь Кругликов. Многофункциональный комплекс фронтовой авиации пятого поколения предназначен для решения широкой авиации пятого поколения. Цель номер 43. Для переправе противника. Цель номер 43.
please subscribe to the channel.